Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and welcome to another episode of EVE Online News, today with the fourth and last report of August. So I'm writing this script over Friday and Saturday, so there is a chance that by the time I get this to you, which is hopefully going to be on that Saturday, the situation might be a little different, or a fight might have broken out in the meantime. If that is the case, then don't worry, it'll get its due attention next time. Still, the week that's come before has been very busy in its own right, with action in Wormhole space as Inner Hell and their allies proved able to successfully evict the Mighty Beans, CCP's release of the MER for July, which highlights the initial economic reactions to many Chaos-era changes, whilst the Legacy Winter War continues to dominate the southeast. But even there we've seen interesting developments, with the Imperium killing a Legacy Titan, and a new objective being placed on the field for the weekend. So we start this week's coverage off in the area of space which I've had the least experience with, wormholes. More specifically, we're going to be looking at the system of J165940, which was the home to the Mighty Beans Wormhole Alliance. And as with most Wormhole Alliance's home wormholes, this means that the system played host to a vast array of structures, with the crown jewel being one of the unique faction fortizars created by the Upwell changes. However, these structures weren't quite the bastions of defense that they would normally prove to be when the Russian wormhole group of Inner Hell initially entered the system with their fleets, intending to push the Beans out of their home, as a few hours before that the Mighty Beans director Townsfolk had decided to take his leave from the Alliance, and removed all of the fittings from these structures on the way out, leaving them completely unarmed. Townsfolk has reportedly denied doing this in conjunction with Inner Hell, although I was unable to personally contact him for comment on this issue. Still, with the time zone difference between the two alliances, Inner Hell was able to reinforce the majority of the structures in the system before the Mighty Beans were able to mount a reaction force of their own to contest this. This meant that the initial contact between the two on that Thursday was light, with the only major losses of note being 4 capitals that were self-destructed by the Mighty Beans, whilst the timers ticked on. The two forces then continued to move around one another over the course of the day, with the second timer of the structure remaining uncontested by the defenders, as they instead tried to use the opportunity to bring more allies into the system for their potential final fight. Inner Hell, for their part, countered this using a method known as doorstopping, and doorstopping involves placing a carrier on the entrance side of a wormhole after destabilizing it to the point that the carrier then jumping back into the system will collapse that hole, and therefore any route into the system. This forces both sides to have to rescan a new hole, but it also cuts off any in-travel reinforcements the moment that they're spotted. This allowed Inner Hell to effectively isolate the defenders inside the hole, although it required them and their allies to hold a fleet that could hold off contest from those defending forces inside the hole for the remainder of the time until that final hole timer ticked over on Sunday, meaning that they needed to run a fleet continually for 3 days after their initial attack on Thursday. This blockade was tested a few times over the course of the eviction, with the Mighty Beans and their allies trying to use Cerberuses and Munins to push through the Nightmare and Loki fleets that Inner Hell had formed for this purpose. However, the majority of attempts were beaten back. Still, for some periods of the late US time zone, where the active pilot population swung more in favour of the Beans, they were able to briefly disrupt hull control and take it over for themselves in order to sneak a few more pilots in, amongst the pages of those who died in the attempt. As Sunday began to roll around, the first structures of the Mighty Beans began to fall, as the earliest possible rolls began to drop out of reinforcement, and this only intensified attempts to bring in more reinforcements into the hole, and both sides skirmished throughout the day. But despite the Beans' best efforts, the defenders inside the hole were still outnumbered, with it reportedly being around 120 to 170 by the time the final timer was coming up. Still, the Beans reportedly had over 200 allies attempting to assist them in their final defense, so Inner Hell had the potential to be split between keeping up pressure on the Fortizar and holding on to control of who entered the system. When the Beans tried to take advantage of this, they managed to briefly wrest hull control back, as the hull of their home was being ground down, but only a handful of interceptors were able to make it before Inner Hell responded, disengaging their forces completely from the Fortizar in order to engage Beans on the hull and forcing them to retreat, once again leaving their allies with no route into the fight. This led to the Beans changing up their tactics for the final time and reshipping into sniper battleships, a mixture of rogues and ravens, along with command destroyers, in order to harass the attacking force and distract from the Fortizar. Whilst this was able to afford them some progress, with the repair timer ticking down to about 10 minutes left, the beans were eventually forced off field after heavy losses, and a few minutes after that, the Fortizar exploded. Now, given that this is Wormhole space, this leads to a massive pinata ball of loot that the attackers were able to scoop up. As I've not directly been able to contact Inner Hell, I don't know their own estimation, but the Mighty Beans director that I talked to estimated that around 200 billion ISK had been looted, on top of the 342 billion that was destroyed during the fighting, self-destructing and killing of unpiloted ships after the destruction of the Citadel. Despite all of this, the beans that I've had a chance to talk to seem relatively upbeat about the whole thing. Whilst their current focus is undoubtedly on getting what they saved from the destruction of their home out of the hole, they seem determined to stay in Wormhole space and are just trying to figure out the where and how of their return will be made. For Inner Hell's part, I wasn't able to contact them directly as I noted. However, reportedly their motivations for this eviction was simply that the Mighty Beans didn't PvP with them enough. So something else that happened this week is the highly anticipated release of the July MER, which should cover the economic impact of the Chaos Era changes, most notably the blackout. Now, I've never claimed to be an economist, and if you ask 3 economists a single question, you'll get 5 answers. But seeing as so many people have asked me for my opinion, what I want to do here is just sit down and try and explain what I think a few graphs are showing and extrapolate just a little bit from the data, but not draw any conclusions. If you'd like to read a bit more in depth, I highly recommend you look at River's article on INN, which I personally found an interesting read. Anyway, let's start with the very first chart that's presented to us in the MER, which is production versus destruction and mining. Now, production is always going to be a huge chunk above destruction, because production includes the creation of a lot of things like ammunition, drones and drugs, which aren't actually destroyed but are consumed. Still, we've been on a 6-month dip in production, starting to creep down to the levels that we saw in 2016, although this could just be an exaggerated version of the normal summer dip. But what really interested me, however, was the fact that there was no significant bump in destruction after the blackout, with a steady average of 1.25 trillion ISK destroyed holding month to month, as this seems to run contrary to a lot of people's anecdotal experiences. Now, the amount mined bar here is also particularly interesting, with it spiking back up to quote-unquote normal levels despite the blackout after the Imperium's return from the north, before then tailing off again and pulling the amount mined below the level needed to cover destruction as we entered August. Bear in mind that dips in mining around August seem to be relatively common, with it being a historical trend over time, having happened over the past 3 years. That said, this may be tied to the commonality of wars in the summer, but be careful before deciding a short-term value shift is indicative of a long-term trend change, especially when it comes to MER data. Now, the next graph that we're going to be taking a look at is one that I've created, and it tracks the MER metrics of Delve and Quirius as well as Esoteria as a percentage of the overall mining and bounties in the game created month to month. Now, this does include Highsec and Lowsec as well as Nullsec in its calculation of 100%, but it shows the slight downward trajectory of the Imperium's hold over the mining share of the game over 2019, before cratering during May and June as they moved their supercapital fleet to the north. However, with them having been back in their home for almost the entirety of this month, it's begun to quickly trend upwards, all the while Esoteria's metrics have been remarkably stable. I think this chart will be more interesting in September when we have the full month of August and a full month of peacetime crabbing for the Imperium to compare it to, as that will allow us to see where the MER share ends up shifting to after the nerfs settle in. And finally, we're going to take a look at what is undoubtedly the most dramatic graph, that of faucets over time. As pretty much anyone can see, there's a massive drop in the golden line that represents bounty prizes across all space. Given that bounty prizes are the majority of Nullsec's PvE reward system, it seems fair to assume that this shows a massive decrease in the amount of players choosing to take part in that activity, which isn't something that we saw as clearly when looking at the mining statistics. Now, something that you can make out here but is better represented in the overall faucet and sink balance diagram is the minimal growth in sinks going out of the economy despite the tax increases that we talked about previously. Still, the sheer drop of ISK coming into the economy has managed to nearly balance out the current faucets and sinks, with only 4 trillion more going in than came out over the course of this month, excluding GM actions. Alright, you still with me? Economic news not scared you away? Excellent. So with that done, let's return to what's been quite the recurring feature on our news updates, the war in the southeast between Legacy and Winter Coalition. To start with, we're going to be taking a look away from the front lines in a region we haven't discussed much so far during the war, which is Legacy's main crabbing region of Esoteria, located right in the centre of their holdings. Last Saturday we saw a quick fight break out there after Ferrata Victrix, a reformed part of the old Stain Russians who Legacy evicted from the area originally back in 2017, spotted a Titan ratting in the northern part of the region, which is the only part of the region in range of Stain. This led to them bat-phoning, of all people, goons, who dropped dreads alongside the Russians and were able to snipe the Titan before significant support arrived, killing the 3 facts dropped to try and save it, before being able to extract most of their ships from the fight due to a lack of bubbles on Legacy's side, with only a handful of capitals actually falling to the defence fleet. Now, on its own, this isn't something I normally cover, but this does help paint the picture of a small resurgence from the ex-Stainwagon Russians, who were also able to claim the TCU of VYJ TAC DA during that same period. As I seem to mention every time, that doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, but it means that effort is being expended on their part, and it's a very clear finger in the eye towards Legacy. So I'll be keeping an eye on this area just to see if Legacy ends up having to match that level of effort expended, and creates a new Esoteria/Stain front to the war, although at this point it seems unlikely to require a large deal of force for Legacy to be able to appropriately deal with the threat. There's also been another small shift in Legacy's home front footing following last week, which saw a focus from Winter Coalition on bringing offensive Entosis to Faith Abolis, although they were largely unsuccessful in making progress. Already Replaced has since been given space in the region, specifically in the centre near the border with Tenerifis, which would serve as Winter Coalition's entrance to that region. With more systems in Faith Abolis already being reinforced, it will be interesting to see if the Alliance can step up and work to help protect the rest of the region from harassment in Tosis, or if they'll become the focus of it as they work to bring up their own ADMs from the one that they start with. The big moves of this week, however, have taken place in Detorid, one of Winterco's core regions. On Thursday we saw yet more SOV skirmishing between the two coalitions, with iHub timers going back and forth, but Legacy eventually walking away with another iHub taken in KE Tag 0FB. That wasn't what most people were talking about on that day, however, as during this fight a pilot that we've featured before, Tree Newbie Ribbons, decided to move his newly replaced Vanquisher through the system of K7S TAC FF via a gate. Apparently this is one of the only ones in Detorid which is not Sino-jammed, and as a result he was scouted, bubbled and dropped, leading to his second Vanquisher loss in less than a month. One of the most amusing parts for me personally is the name that was chosen for his Vanquisher, which translates literally to Keep Jumping Dreads You Grandson Test, which obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but from what I understand having talked to translators is effectively him claiming to be quote-unquote senior and therefore better than Test in an insulting manner, by proxy effectively calling Test children. Now it's been confirmed in a few pings that this wasn't some grand strategic bait, but merely someone being vastly overconfident and dying for that, so it's unlikely to have a huge impact on the war. But still, props to Tree Newbie for at least paying for a few months of server time. On Friday though, we saw something much more significant, as Test placed a Keepstar in the system of QLPX TAC J, where they held SOV. This gave Winter Coalition only a day to react before the structure was brought online, and despite some anticipation on my and others' parts that this might break out into a fight, they preemptively declared their decision to cede the objective publicly. Whilst there was some suspicion about whether or not this could be a ruse cruise, it did turn out to be genuine, and as of recording, Legacy now has an operational Keepstar from which to project force from in Detorid, and possibly more importantly, one that can be jumped to from Legacy's current holdings in Immensea. This will potentially allow Legacy to bring their supercapital umbrella forwards as the war progresses, and put even further pressure on unjammed systems in the region, although the need to continue chipping away at iHubs and jammers remains if Legacy wants to properly leverage this advantage further. It's also worth noting that this position doesn't cover the eastern half of the region, including Winter's staging system of O3 TAC 4MN, so looking to see how Legacy tries to facilitate a push east will be critical over the next few weeks, and on the other hand, seeing how, or even if, Winter Coalition decides to deal with this new threat will tell us a lot about the new strategies referred to in ELO's pings. One final story to wrap things up with is something that's actually been developing in the background over the past fortnight, starting with a slightly ominous addition to the patch notes which explained, quote, Triglavian recon vessels have been sighted outside of invasion zones, unquote, without much more explanation as to what that actually means. Now in practice, what these seem to be is much further scaled down versions of the Drifter attacks that we saw in nullsec during July, with them exclusively focusing on players rather than attacking structures, and lacking a point or web and vastly reduced DPS and speed when compared to the Drifters. They seem to be able to spawn pretty much anywhere in Highsec and roam in groups of 3 with 2 remote repair vessels, and like most PvE in EVE, can be handily dealt with by just a healer. The first kill recorded by these ships was a simple exploration Helios, and since then they've gone on to rack up over 100 billion ISK of kills in Highsec over the course of half a month, with frigates, mining barges, corvettes and orcas being the primary targets. This seems like it could be an attempt to clamp down on AFK mining in Highsec, though we'll have to wait and see for an answer to both how impactful they are, and also to see how they might change moving forwards. I know I'm only covering this because I somehow managed to lose a ship to these things, so feel free to tell me about your run-ins with them and commiserate with me in the comments below, or just call me a bad, both work. Alright, well, thank you very much for watching. A special shout out goes to Pinch A Infidel, our Crassus from Old School, as well as to our $5 patrons Dustin Prater, Meeks and Czar. I appreciate you all supporting this content, and I'm sorry for the relatively quiet week, but you should have an interesting interview tomorrow to make up for it. Until next time folks, take care and fly smart.